So chapter one, module one of the course starts to answer the question that we're all wondering right now is why are we doing this? Why are we looking at single system design and how does it relate to the practice of social work? Most of the time when I'm looking through people's short introductions, the question that I get the most is that people are concerned about the statistical component of the course, or that they don't feel so comfortable looking at anything to do with like any kind of quantitative analysis. So I assure you that the purpose of the course isn't to torture you or to make you to do any kind of advanced statistical analyses. But if you've ever worked in the practice of any kind of social science, you're probably wondering, is what I'm doing really helping my client? Surely everybody who gets into a field such as social science is hoping to help people with their lives in some meaningful, valued way. And single system design is a great way of helping you to do that. Not just kind of a feeling, but more of like a scientific, quantitative, evidence-based type of approach to looking at whether or not what we're doing actually is helping somebody and if they're making meaningful, significant improvements in their life. So that's why I think single system design and client-centered evaluation is such an interesting topic. It's something that I incorporate into my clinical practice. And I'm hoping by the end of the semester and by the end of completing your single system design project that you'll actually be able to incorporate some of these skills into your clinical practice and have some evidence that what you're doing is actually working to improve your clients' outcomes. So, why evaluate? That's the big question that we're hoping to cover in the first chapter. Depending on where you work, some places actually require people to do evidence-based measures. Measure client changes to show for a grant or for credentialing purposes that you're actually making some kind of improvements, measurable, quantifiable improvements with the populations that you're meeting with. But even if it's not required, you as a practitioner may still want to know whether or not what you're doing is actually working. And if it's not working, what you can do to see some improvement, to see some quantifiable change within your client. And I think that's why single system design has such a unique advantage and is such a great practice tool for any kind of clinician. I think it can be beneficial to a clinician to see if what they're doing is actually working, but also to the client to help it increase their motivation. And throughout the semester, I'm hoping that you're going to learn a few different ways to evaluate your practice and to really strengthen the kind of clinical work that you're doing. Okay, so for the 8 steps of evaluating practice, the first step is obviously identifying the client who's going to be identifying the goal. And in the textbook, there's an example of Philip who comes up with the goal of feeling less depressed. So that can be like a pretty common goal that you hear a lot. A lot of people might talk about mood stability or improving their mood, but people really struggle with what that actually looks like and what that actually means and how they can actually put measurable terms to that. So with single system design, you can really help to put numbers to what that actually means and evaluate your progress towards that. The second step is to select intermediate objectives and targets. It's taking the bigger goal and breaking it down to steps along the way. So the goals that we're going to set aren't necessarily dichotomous, like you reached a goal or you didn't, but there's important steps and objectives along the way that are going to help you get to the end of the path that you're hoping to take with your client. And through practice evaluation, we can look at some of those intermediate goals and to acknowledge when we've met them or when we've got to that point. So an example of a step towards feeling less depressed might be 50% improvement from a baseline measure. So if your baseline measure was that your mood was clinically significant on the Beck Depression Inventory, we might look for a 50% improvement in mood-related symptoms halfway through treatment, maybe like 4 to 6 weeks down the road. And for your single system design, one of the biggest issues that people come across is coming up with an operationally defined problem, which is something that we're going to be spending quite a bit of time talking about here. So how can you actually operationalize mood? How can you operationalize exercise? How can you operationalize cigarette smoking, for instance? So we'll be talking quite a bit about how you can break that down into something that you can put like a yardstick to. So for mood, you could use something like a standardized measure, such as the Beck Depression Scale. You could also put number of social interactions that somebody has per day, or number of self-care activities partaken in a day. There's a few different ways that you can measure as complicated and multifaceted as somebody's mood and mental health. The third step is to identify evidence-based general practices. And in this class, it's not so much of an intervention course, so your grade isn't going to depend on the quality of your intervention per se. But what I'm really interested in is that you can look in for that you can find an intervention that's evidence-based from literature, so that you know how to use the literature to support the type of work that you're doing. And practice evaluation will really help you to determine if the intervention that you've selected is actually appropriate for the client problem that you're hoping to address. One of the really unique things that we're going to be doing in this course with looking at your own specific single system design is actually being able to graph and visualize your data. We're going to be spending a significant amount of time looking at trends, stability level, really looking at what's going on with your client. And hopefully that'll help you to utilize it within your practice so that you can show your client visualizations of their data. And graphs can be really powerful in helping you to illustrate these to the population that you'll be working with. So to break it down a little bit further, the step one with setting goals and objectives, you're going to be completing a goals table for your project and for your assignment. There's long-term and intermediate goals. Long-term is the desired outcome, with intermediate goals along the way, which can be considered objectives or stepping stones along the path to your final outcome. So basically coming up with a roadmap before you start with your single system design. Step two would be coming up with a specific objective or a target. Again, we talk about an operationally defined problem, which is something that is breaking a problem down into something really quantifiable. So number of cigarettes smoked per day, minutes spent exercising per day, minutes spent sleeping per day. And for me personally, I prefer it to be in the smallest increment of measurement possible. So a lot of times people might say, did the client exercise today? Yes, no. That might tell us very little about what constitutes exercise and what doesn't. So the clearer you can make your operationally defined problem, the better off you're going to be with your single system design. Step three, again, looking at your data plots. Something that the book covers quite a bit and that you'll learn more about throughout the course is two different phases. A baseline phase, or phase A, is what would be expected to happen if there was no intervention. And with single system design, many practitioners often collect data either retrospectively or prior to completing an intervention to see what the baseline problem looked like before there was any kind of intervention. And the reason people might do this is because you want to get like an idea of what the problem was like before you stepped into the picture. Sometimes just, being involved in a case can really, cause people to really evaluate what they're doing. But most of the time, coming up with a baseline, you might get an idea of what somebody's mood was like before they started to partake in CBT for depression or a smoking cessation program, how many cigarettes they were smoking a day before they started to do this other thing. And then your intervention phase would be obviously phase B after you started the intervention. And then you'll be able to identify what kind of changes in behavior were associated with that intervention. From the case study on page 8 is a good example of this from your textbook. Give you a good idea of what we can really pull from single system design and the different phases. Something that is unique on figure 8 is actually the maintenance phase, which we'll also talk about in further detail later on in the semester. So step 5 is to construct clear benchmarks for success. The textbook talks about quantifiable terms to which you could use for benchmarks. But in addition to like a statistically significant change, we're also going to be talking about clinically significant changes in the course, which can be meaningful to the client if they feel like they've reached their goals. Even if you do meet your goals, it's also important to engage the client to see if they feel that their goals have been met. And if they weren't, what else can be done? All right, so for step 7 is just to introduce the client to a maintenance phase, which is basically what the follow-up would be after they met those goals. So would it be regular appointments, continuing to meet, but less frequently? It could be a continuation of the intervention at a less frequent duration, or it could just be eliminating if they've met their goals and they feel fine. It could be just a termination. And what we'll finish up with this semester is just analyzing your SSD. So the maintenance phase, basically this is where the client's becoming a little bit more autonomous. So the professional trains the client on performing a feasible version of the intervention. So they're starting to basically do the intervention by themselves with, you could view it as taking off the training wheels of having an additional person to support them. They're really just doing it themselves now. But you would encourage them to continue to keep data just as they were before. That helps you to see if they're declining, then maybe they need to have more regular treatment. Again, certainly it's hard to convince a client to keep up with data when you're not seeing them, but sometimes there's just maintenance phone calls that can be helpful and just kind of encouraging them to keep up with their measurement. There's certainly people that I've seen have completed treatment successfully, and instead of seeing them weekly, I might see them monthly, maybe every other month, and maybe just follow-up calls as needed from then on. And we'll see if they just keep up with the successes that they made in phase B. And as you complete your own single system design, as you write this up, you'll be able to look at the data that you've got in graphical format, looking at the graphs and describing them, whether or not you've met your objective measurable targets of the intervention, and ultimately be able to see if you've met statistical significance, practical significance, and what the effect of your single system design actually was. And if you look at page 10 of your textbook, you'll kind of see a flow chart of how we come up with the problem, how we would put measurements to it, how we would operationalize the problem, and how we'd also ultimately evaluate our progress towards meeting their goals. And the flow of the remainder of the course basically works in the flow that's laid out in this diagram. So even though it might seem a little bit overwhelming at first as you're starting this course, as we proceed and you're working on your single system design, you'll see that it's probably not too hard from what you've already been doing in practice, but this will help you to take more scientific approaches to looking at more of like an evidence-based intervention to see if what you're doing is actually having the intended effect that you'd want it to. Where in this black box of the practice that we have, we often think of which variables or which interventions we think are working, and single system design really helps you to look at, are they working? Are they having the intention that we want them to? Are they not? And if they're not, what can we really do to get to where we want to be? And just a last point of discussion here, why is it important to get the client's point of view of their presenting concern and keep their perspective in everything? I know that oftentimes we kind of come in with some of our own presumptions and kind of our own goals and where we would like things to be going. But it's also important to kind of check in with the client to see if they're getting what they want out of treatment. Certainly there's times where a client might be mandated to treatment, such as substance abuse cases or something along those lines. But all the same, it's still important to check in to see if they're feeling better, if they're happy about the progress that they're making. And maybe a caveat here is that sometimes changing behaviors or changing habits, sometimes people aren't going to feel good at first. So smoking cigarettes, you can imagine somebody's not going to feel good when they're giving up cigarette smoking that they've been doing for however long. So if they're not feeling good about it, it's important to kind of get their feedback and reflect back to them that things might get worse, or you might feel worse before things are actually going to start getting better. So an important thing to keep in mind. And also, I mean, with everything that we do, it's important to think about the ethical considerations of measuring client concerns. So some of the obvious ones would be confidentiality, informed consent, making sure that somebody agrees to the type of intervention that we're doing in the data storage, and making sure that we're not sharing this with people that don't need to be knowing about it. So we'll be spending a lot of time talking about informed consent and what that means. I would also just say that single system design in itself is an ethical issue because we want to be presenting the best possible practices that we can. And certainly through doing practice evaluation, that helps us to hold us accountable and making sure that we're providing the best possible services that are out there.